Thank you very much for coming to attend this program tonight. I'm going to lay out 4 questions that our panelists will address this evening, and then we'll have a follow-up Q&A. First, I'll ask the speakers to briefly describe their church's history. 2, what is the state of your archives? Is it organized or in boxes? Number 3, what are some highlights of it? And finally, what are the challenges in your archive? The first speaker is Gene Cooper of Lincoln Temple. Gene Cooper became part of Lincoln Congregational Temple, United Church of Christ, as a young teen, and over the years served the church in various capacities. Since the church's final worship service in September 2018, Ms. Cooper has been part of a team charged with envisioning and planning for the future uses of the church building and the preservation of valuable memorabilia and artifacts. Jean?
Good evening, everyone, and I want to thank All Souls for providing this forum for churches like Lincoln Temple and others that have had a profound impact on the DC community over the years. And happy to talk about our history as we go through the next several slides, and then I'll answer some questions in the end of that. Looking at this map, Lincoln Temple is located at the northeast corner of 11th and R Streets Northwest. The history of Lincoln Temple spans more than 150 years, beginning with the establishment of the Colfax Mission, which was built in 1869. And there, lodging, education, industrial training, and religious instruction were provided to persons of African descent newly freed from slavery. And in 1995, Lincoln Temple was listed on the National Register of Historic Places by the historic name Lincoln Industrial Mission, Lincoln Memorial Congregational Church. Next slide. Here you see a letter written by General Oliver O. Howard, that's his handwriting, who headed the Freedmen's Bureau in 1867, and he's asking the congregational churches to donate funds to build the mission. The funds came from several sources, including from Reverend John Alvoyd and Friends of First Congregational Church, as well as the American Missionary Association and the Freedmen's Bureau. Next slide. Now, 2 churches were built on this site. This is a picture of the first church building, which was replaced in 1928 by the current edifice. In this slide, you see a picture of the laying of the cornerstone of the current building in 1928. Now, in 1901, the congregation gathered, in 1901, Lincoln Memorial Congregational Church and Park Temple Congregational Church merged. And here you see, I suppose, the signing of the agreement documents that declare the merger. On your left, seated on your left, is Judge Robert Terrell, who was the husband of Mary Church Terrell. And the lovely Mary Church Terrell here is said to have led the effort to bring about the merger of the 2 congregations. She and Judge Terrell were members of Park Temple before the merger. And then you have a picture of Men's Day. The men gathered, it looks like behind the first church building for a photo after their Men's Day service. And here is a picture of the 1928 church picnic of the Sunday school. Now, this photo shows on the left a plaque that was, I suppose, devised in roughly 1925, so the mid-1920s, to pay tribute to departed church members. And on the right, you see Mary Europe, who is the sister of James Reese Europe. Miss Europe was in her own right a musician, choir director, piano teacher, and her brother, of course, is renowned for his compositions and arrangements of jazz and ragtime music. This is a valuable portrait. It's Reverend Robert Brooks, who led Lincoln Temple between 1923 and 1952. And it was under his leadership that the current building was erected and the mortgage was retired. So he didn't play. He said, okay, we're gonna build this church and we're gonna pay for it. So next we have a sketch of Reverend Channing E. Phillips, under whose ministry I came to Lincoln Temple, and I was confirmed as a teen. And during his term, 1961 to 1970, and after the riots that occurred following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., a partnership was formed between Lincoln Temple and Westmoreland Congregational Church to develop Lincoln Westmoreland apartments. And in 2015, the Channing E. Phillips homes were built adjacent to the original dwellings. And these are located on 7th Street, not far from Howard University. Artifacts shown in this curio cabinet here are examples of a good number of items, including the curio cabinet, that may well have value to be determined. And next we have Derek and Ann Houston, who is our church historian, seated at a table featuring items that were on display at our pop-up museum, which the DC Public Library was instrumental in inspiring us to do and helping us to put on. And you'll see kind of in the lower, and there are places on the screen where you see pictures of people with their feet in the reflecting pool during the March on Washington in 1963. And it's notable that a number of marchers were given breakfast at Lincoln Temple before they went down to the monument. More pictures of newsletters and programs, pictures and reports that we have to preserve. And finally, this is one of many precious stained glass windows in the church, featuring a prominent family of Frederick Douglass. Mrs. Fanny Douglass was the granddaughter-in-law of Frederick Douglass. Her husband was Frederick Douglass III. So all of these items are but a few among Lincoln Temple's archives. And as we suspended operations in 2018 and no longer are in the building on a regular basis as a congregation, we are challenged to assemble and store our archives in one place. We have had help from Lisa Rochard of the Georgetown Day School, who helped to preserve a number of our photographs and papers, including the letter from General Howard. And some of these items are stored in boxes, and we've given some to the library. We have some at home in our own homes. And so this event has prompted us to think more carefully and more, I said deliberately, about how to collect and store, preserve these valuable records of our culture and our church. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. Our next speaker is Vanette Saunders. Vanette Saunders is a native Washingtonian and a lifelong member of First Baptist Church, Georgetown, growing up in the church and serving in various positions and ministries. She's been working with the church's Historic Archives Ministry since its inception in the early 2000s, became the ministry's chair in 2015, and continues to hold that position. Ms. Saunders also serves as co-chair of the Heritage and Archives Committee of the Washington, D.C. alumni chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Vanette?
Okay, good evening. Thanks for inviting me to speak at this event. First Baptist Church, Georgetown was established in October 1862 by a former slave named Reverend Sandy Alexander, We will celebrate our 160th anniversary this October. Originally, the church was considered as a community church since most of its members lived in walking distance. But now the church is considered a commuter church since all members commute. Today, we are a small family church with a membership of about 125 persons. The Historic Archives Ministry was created in the early 2000s. The actual archives collection was set up in 2015. Once the archives was set up, the collection was officially named the Reverend Sandy Alexander Collection. The collection is housed in the basement of the annex building located next to the church. The collection provides information about the church on subjects such as its anniversaries, ministries, pastors, and meeting minutes. We have copies of Sunday bulletins that date back to the 1940s. We also have copies of funeral programs of deceased members. We have a lot of documents from the Christian Endeavor Society, which is an international youth training organization that the church belonged to. Some of the items include meeting minutes, pictures of projects, and programs. We also have some documentation on old Black Georgetown that provide information on the Black families that lived in Georgetown and the Black businesses that were located there. We have binders of old photos which include pictures of church groups and individual members. Some are shown here. Here's a large church membership picture that was taken by the Skurlock Studio. It is a 1940s picture of the church membership with the pastor, T. Ewell Hopkins. The collection includes information in various formats such as paper documents, audio tapes, pictures, and artifacts. Shown here is a selection of audio tapes of the various services from the 1980s and 1990s. We have two glass cases in the church that are used to display collection items. One houses some of our earliest church artifacts, such as Reverend Sandy Alexander's Bible. You should see where the arrow's pointing, a 1904 utility bill, and an old member directory. Next slide. The case also has a binder of church newsletter issues from 1914 to 1921. And this here is shown the December 1914 issue. The second glass case spotlights an area of the church's history, and the focus changes each year. The case currently is spotlighting the Sunday school ministry. Some of the items displayed are past Sunday school programs and a picture of the station wagon that was purchased by the Sunday school for transportation. Some of the challenges that were encountered in building and maintaining the collection were: one, finding an accessible but secure location to house the collection. The church has very little free space. Two, maintaining a safe, healthy environment to keep the items from deteriorating. Since the collection is located in the annex basement, we have to work to control the humidity. Three, determining what to include or exclude in the collection. Four, setting up a process to allow persons to utilize the collection. This included deciding whether to allow items to be taken off-site or not. The decision was made to keep all collection items on site. And finally, finding ways to use the collection to promote interest in the history of the church. And using one of the glass cases that was shown earlier to showcase specific subject matters is one of the ways that we did so. In summary, the First Baptist Church Reverend Sandy Alexander Collection is a vital instrument in preserving our church history.
Thank you, Vanette. Our next speaker is Sarah Fairbrother. Sarah Fairbrother is a longtime resident of DC, a graduate of both George Washington University and American University, and a former project director for Cultural Tourism DC. She currently serves as administrator at Riverside Baptist Church. Sarah?
Thank you, Derek. Good evening. Well, as you can see on the map, we're the one down at the bottom in Southwest, right by the river. Riverside Baptist Church was founded in 1857 by Reverend Chastain Clark Meador as a missionary Sunday school for the island and called Island Baptist Church. The first congregation met in what our records call the small wooden building on D Street Southwest between 4.5 and 6th Street Southwest. In Island Baptist was renamed Fifth Baptist as they outgrew the small wooden building and built a brick building on the same site in 1869 to accommodate the growing congregation. We do not have a picture of that building. In 1902, the church relocated to 6.5 and E Street Southwest due to problems with the new railroad roundhouse at the old site disrupting services. They may have met in an interim building during construction, but we're not certain. During this time, the church was a white church and was large and influential. I have heard numbers up to 1,500 members, but I haven't located the membership rolls to support that yet. In 1963, after being assured that the church would not lose its site in the urban renewal of Southwest, the site was taken by eminent domain, and the church relocated to 7th and I Street Southwest, dedicating its new building in April 1968. In the interim, services were held in Hogate's restaurant just across Main Avenue. The next year, the church was renamed Riverside Baptist Church due to its new location. Urban renewal and change to the neighborhood and to the city took a toll on membership, leaving under 50 members. Perhaps fewer because, again, membership records are uncatalogued and probably incomplete. In 1971, the church hired Reverend Frank Foster as senior pastor. He came on the condition that the church agree to become a deliberately integrated church. When Foster was killed in a plane crash in May 1972, the church continued on the path he had laid out. Today, the church is multicultural and predominantly African American. In 2016, as the redevelopment of Southwest began again, the church subdivided its lot, selling the northern half for development. You can see the apartment building behind us there, and building a new building on the corner of 7th and Main Southwest. The building was dedicated in November 2018. The congregation remains small, and again, change has taken its toll on membership. So as you can see, this church is a microcosm of the development and change in Southwest DC and the larger city over the years. Our history is linked with this neighborhood and this city. While the majority of history inquiries we get are genealogical, we could also be a source for DC and national history. But as it stands, we can't help much with either kind of information. The moves have taken their toll on our archives. Every time you move, things are lost. As members die or move away, unrecorded memories are lost. Pictures that everyone could once identify become anonymous. Stories that everyone knew are forgotten. The sudden nature of the move in the 1960s meant there was not much time to prepare and no way to store many artifacts. While we still have a few, as you can see in the cabinet there, we know many things were lost. Records are also lost as they are hastily packed and stored. We have boxes of photos and documents. We have artifacts in the cabinets. We have, you can see one in the front there, some photos that were stored rolled that we haven't been able to look at yet, as they would crumble if we unrolled them, and we haven't gotten help to unroll them yet. While preparing to move out of the last building, we attempted to triage what we were taking. I did not know what other records and artifacts we might have. Some artifacts, like those vases in the picture, were in use in the sanctuary, and some were displayed in cabinets in the parlor, which had been named the Foster Room in memory of Frank Foster. There were some in the safe and some in the filing cabinets. While cleaning out the Foster Room, I found some randomly stored in a sideboard. Then we found a storage room in the basement. While we knew it was there, we didn't really know what was in it. A charter school had been in the basement for a number of years, and we didn't use the storage room much. We didn't know there were a number of boxes and a filing cabinet full of old photos and documents in there. At first, I was annoyed they had been stashed and forgotten, but looking at it now, I am very grateful to the former chair of trustees who stored them there because they weren't lost. We sent a number of items to storage while we built the new building, but knowing that many of the archive items were fragile and that the storage was not climate controlled, many of the archive items spent the time during construction in my spare bedroom. During that time, we tried to do some organizing and documenting, but the lack of space and the time demands of the construction and several moves between temporary offices made that difficult. It also made having guests difficult. We have some photos that help tell part of our story, but there are large gaps in that knowledge. For example, in 1910, we can see that the church supported a number of domestic and international ministries. But how did we get there and what happened next? We have portraits of people who were important in the early years of the church. Some are identified, some are not. And we have not yet found the records that indicate what these folks did or who they were beyond names and titles. We have things like our World War II and World War I rolls of honor. We have the cornerstone from the last building and wonder what happened to the other cornerstones. As we approach our 165th anniversary this July, we are attempting to sort, document, file, and catalog records and photos to make them available to researchers and to have our congregation learn about our history. We're hoping to bring some of the items out for everyday use or display. For example, there are 2 plaques in the atrium right now, the founding pastor and an early deacon who was essential to keeping the church going through issues with the railroad. They were both Southerners, and the founding pastor was a Confederate sympathizer. The deacon probably was too. While this is part of our history and we cannot ignore it, we would like to show how we have changed to who we are today. Our portrait of Frank Foster, seen on the left, needs to be reframed, have a small informational plaque added, and be hung in the atrium, because we are at least as proud of where we have come to as where we have come from. So we want our records to be available for researchers and our members, but the only way to do that is to take a very small group of volunteers and work through it. It's slow. We also need to focus on our current records so our successors don't find themselves in this position again.
Thank you, Sarah. Before I introduce our final speaker, please don't be shy. We're going to open up the Q&A after Mara Cherkasky's presentation. So please put your questions in the chat and we'll get to those after Mara's talk. Mara Cherkasky is a longtime resident of DC and the co-founder of both the historical research firm Prologue DC and the digital public history project Mapping Segregation in Washington, DC. She joined the All Souls Unitarian Archives team in 2012. Mara?
Thanks, Derek. I just realized I was unmuted the whole time. Thanks very much for the introduction and for hosting this, or moderating this, actually. Okay, I'm doing my presentation and the slides at the same time, so now I'm two-handed here. In 1820, a group of prominent white men started meeting at the Friends of Unitarian Christianity, and on August 1st of that year, they adopted this resolution to build a church. The founders included architect of the Capitol, Charles Bulfinch, his son, Thomas Bulfinch, Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, later president between 1825 and 1829, and Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun, who was later vice president to John Quincy Adams. Adams was anti-slavery, while Calhoun adamantly supported slavery, but they found common ground in religion. Charles Bulfinch was asked to design a building for the corner of 6th and D Streets Northwest, a block from the then City Hall. In September 1821, he wrote Paul Revere's son, Joseph Revere, about casting a bell for the church. Revere responded right away. He recommended a bell weighing between 1,000 and 1,200 pounds and promised to make as good a bell as possible for 40 cents a pound. One of the donors for the bell, which would also be used to announce fires or emergencies in town, was President James Monroe, who gave $100. On November 11th, 1821, the first Unitarian Church, Washington, D.C., was formally organized. We started celebrating our bicentennial this past November 11th and are continuing for a full year. The church was dedicated in 1822. This photo was taken probably about 50 years later. The old Recorder of Deeds building is on the site now. Jumping ahead to the 1850s, slavery was legal in Washington, and it was a contentious issue in the church because the membership comprised Northerners and Southerners. But the denomination was and is based in New England. Some ministers tended to be anti-slavery. Here in Washington, they were asked not to preach about this issue. In 1854, the congregation hired a 22-year-old minister named Moncure Conway, who was the son of slaveholders, but had come to hate slavery. In this January 26, 1856 sermon, he said, "I shall waste no words on the dogma that such subjects, that is, slavery, are not proper to the pulpit. Christ and Paul found them appropriate to their ministry. If moral questions should not enter here, what should?" This sermon garnered him a warning, but 6 months later, he preached against slavery again and was fired. After the Civil War, the congregation started raising money for a new building. They built one at 14th and L Streets Northwest and moved in 1877. They also changed their name to All Souls at that time. A few decades later, the congregation was outgrowing its building again and bought a lot farther uptown. This photo is part of a panoramic view of the construction site, and we're looking northwest at the intersection of 16th Street and Columbia Road with Mount Pleasant in the background. Here's the church in the 1930s. We're still in that building and with more than 1,000 members. Police Boys Club number 10 started meeting in the basement of the church in 1937 and grew to serve 400 boys a day. In the 1940s, under the leadership of Reverend A. Powell Davies, the church became one of the few places in DC where interracial groups could meet, and it started advocating for an end to segregation. Reverend Davies suggested to the Boys Club that they integrate, but nothing happened. Finally, in 1954, when schools desegregated, the church put its foot down. The Boys Club moved out rather than integrate. To take its place, All Souls formed the Columbia Heights Boys Club. It was the city's first integrated youth club. In time, it admitted girls too, becoming the Columbia Heights Youth Club. Jumping ahead again, this is 1974, and that's Black Panther Bobby Seale in the pulpit, invited by Reverend David Eaton, who's sitting below him on the stairs. Reverend Eaton had arrived in 1969 and was the first African-American minister of a large Unitarian congregation. So that's all the church history I'm going to have time for right now, so move to the archives. We have quite a large archives in the church basement. This is our workroom, but we haven't worked in there for 2 years, so things have piled up. The boxes on the shelves in the rear hold hundreds of photographs, many of which are digitized. We have loads of photos by Nancy Shia on an external hard drive, almost all unlabeled. We also have blueprints, an old member card file, an old visitor log, old Board of Trustee minutes, all kinds of things. We have 30 file cabinets of documents. This is our back room where most of the file cabinets are. They're up on cinder blocks because once, this is before my time, when the archive was in a different basement room, it flooded and ruined part of the collection. We have recordings of services starting about 1980. We've digitized maybe 50 of them. So that's a challenge, getting the rest digitized and figuring out how best to store the files. Climate control is another issue. The temperature is mostly okay since we insulated the pipes that run across the ceiling, but it's too dry in the winter and too humid in the summer. It's hard to stay ahead just in maintaining the collection and also in responding to research requests because we're volunteers, of course, and only have so much time. We haven't yet dealt with born digital documents at all, so that's another challenge. I'll end on a upbeat note. These are 4 recent projects based on our collection: a book, an online exhibition of Black Memory History Project, an exhibit on the building, various buildings and building construction in the library, and an upcoming exhibition on the Reverend David Eaton, which will be outside the Eaton room upstairs in the church. That's it for me. Thank you. So I'm going to stop.
Thank you, Mara.
I'm going to stop the share now, I think.
Okay.
Okay.
These are all wonderful stories and true gems of DC history. Before we get to the Q&A, I believe we have Ann McDonough, Deputy Director of the DC History Center. I was asked to call on her first if she wanted to.
Hey, Derek.
Okay.
Hi, all. Would you mind if I share my screen just briefly? I think, Mara, if you can let me do that. And if not, no worries. So as Derek mentioned, I'm Ann McDonough. I'm the Deputy Director of the DC History Center. And for those of you who are not familiar with us, the DC History Center is a nonprofit, community-supported educational and research organization. And our mission is to deepen understanding of our city's past to connect, empower, and inspire.
I'm sharing now.
Okay,
great.
Okay, so I'll share in just a second. But we do this work through research and scholarship, youth education, and adult programs, as well as exhibits. Our organization, including the Kiplinger Research Library and our 3 exhibit spaces, is located in the historic Carnegie Library at Mount Vernon Square, and you can find us online at dchistory.org and on social media. So what I'm going to do with sharing is I wanted to, having seen one of the questions in the chat about, is there a place where a list of where church archives across the city might be found? And to my knowledge, there isn't such a list just yet. But one of the things we're doing over the DC History Center is trying to use a platform that called LibGuides to highlight resources we do have at the Kiplinger Research Library, but also to highlight those that are available at other repositories and in the hands of organizations themselves, such as churches. So I've highlighted, here we have one that is about exploring the collections in general. Another one, which I think might be of interest to folks who are participating in tonight's program, because it's researching family history, for which church archives are really wonderful resources. Researching building history, which again, church archives come into play here, because the buildings that these churches build and create and occupy really have a tremendous impact on the city as a whole. These are all very developed guides. What I'm previewing next, this group is actually the first to even see this. I'm going to pop the link in the chat in a few minutes. This is a guide that is not officially published yet, but it is for compiling resources relating to researching places of worship. So in this guide, we have information about tonight's program. So if you miss any of the details that some of the speakers were presenting, we actually have it on this LibGuide. But among the DC History Center resources that we've listed are the archives of specific churches that have donated their records to us, as well as materials like printed materials, ephemera, photographs that reflect churches and other places of worship across the city. Now, the reason why I'm highlighting this is because this is just the seed of what I think could become a really helpful resource for researchers across the city, which would be including the direct links to how to access the archives at various churches across the city. So the panelists from tonight were generous enough to include their contact information for the specific churches that were featured tonight. And those are included in the LibGuide. But I could see us as we move forward, as researchers become aware of a particular church archive that is available to the public, we could add that contact information to this list. So it could become something that is both generated by the repositories and the churches themselves, but also populated by researchers. So with that, I'm going to stop my screen sharing, and I'll pop that link in the chat. But I did notice that there was a question in the chat about, is there one central location where people can find all of this information? And I'd be so thrilled to be wrong, but to my knowledge, there is not yet. So with that, I'm just going to turn it back to you, Derek. And thanks for letting me pop in.
Sure, Ann, no problem, thanks. Okay, we have a few in here. Let's see. So hold on a second. One question, Jean, this would be for you. Why did Lincoln Temple suspend operations?
Okay, yeah, I saw that. I mean, there are a number of reasons. Lincoln Temple is near downtown, and most recently, the changes in the Shaw community, which is where it is located, have, I suppose, created some barriers for people, particularly the elderly who were driving into church or getting transportation into church. There was no place to park, or very few places to park. Now, gentrification isn't responsible for that, but there was an instance where one Sunday morning we arrived and two of the parking spaces catacornered across from the front of the building were taken up by bike thingies. And so that was a surprise. You know, people who normally would have parked there, you know, could not park there. So you either circled the block or you, I guess, went home or to another church. But then there are several churches within that block of where Lincoln is. Across from us is 10th Street Baptist, there's Vermont Avenue Baptist, there's what was Metropolitan Baptist, and so on. So the competition for parking spaces was one issue. Through the 150 years or so of existence, both in both buildings, people would walk to church. And so as communities changed, members moved. And if they didn't come back to Lincoln, you know, they were someplace else. But I think to a large extent, we suspended worship when we realized we couldn't sustain a pastor. The congregation had dwindled so much that we recognized that some of that was the result of people dying out and and their families not being there. Mainline churches in general were experiencing a change in was the worship service really happening for them, or the format, that kind of thing, or they just did not see it as important as it once was. So I would say a combination of factors, but we certainly are, the church certainly isn't a location where a lot of change has come about with respect to housing and so on.
Thanks, Jean. The next one is very, very important. I wanted to give everyone a chance to address it. So it's be like a little just going around. Can you talk about the history of women that's revealed in the records of the churches under discussion? That's a really good one. I don't know who wants to start.
Well, this is Bennett. I can say that through researching and gathering the information from my church's history, we've noticed that women have always been very important. They've participated fully in the operation of the church. Like, for example, the 1914 to 1921 newsletter issues, I'm going through them now, reading them, and it seems like many of the activities that were done in the church were led by women. So at least in my church, women have always taken a leadership role.
Yeah, and similarly, Derek, if I can jump in, that's true for Lincoln Temple as well. And you heard me say, and you saw a mention of Mary Church Terrell. Well, she was instrumental, as I said, in influencing or recommending, or she was moving and shaking behind the scenes at least to get the merger happening. But many of you will be familiar with her name as someone who was an activist. She was a human activist. And Vinette and I can relate to her as an honorary member of our sorority, Delta Sigma Theta. She was with our 22 founders in marching for suffrage for women in 1913. So she is just one example, and she's probably a more stellar example, but I think through the years, women have played a vital role. Now, we may not have been front and center in terms of being seen, but that doesn't mean we weren't involved.
Well, for us at Riverside, we have ordained women for a long time. We've had women deacons for a long time. However, our archives are kind of a pile of boxes of documents. And so I have pictures of women, and I know that there were some prominent early women, but I don't have the stories. Not yet. I'm sure they're there somewhere. I have stumbled across a number of Women's Society directories and some meeting minutes. There must be more. I just haven't found it yet.
And I know for Vermont Avenue, we, and shout out to Gene Cooper and the Deltas, that our church meetings were held primarily because a woman started them before our church was founded. Like Sarah Fairbrother, I think it is. Hi, Sarah. Our records at the moment are just all over the place, our archives, and we've had fits and starts of our history committee and trying to get things going. And we now have a strategic plan, and we've even created a cohort of churches that have some relationship to Vermont Avenue to gather those stories. And of course, I'm hoping that since March is National Women's History Month, that people will once again get excited about trying to get, you have to do it in bits and pieces. And as Jean said, with the congregations dwindling, and the amount of resources not being available, and us not being able to be together for the last 2 years, it's been somewhat of a task trying to get up and running again. But yeah, when I look at our records, even though our male leaders held the titles and were put out there, and of course, were always pastors, the women were behind, they were the wheels. So we're working on that.
Women were also work behind the scenes at All Souls. I see there's other All Souls people here, so I'll let them jump in too, but there was a women's alliance and that type of thing, but women on the board of trustees, that was pretty late. Women ministers, that's pretty recent. We were updating this history of All Souls that I showed the cover. We added 50 years. It was first written in 1970, and we just revised it with adding, the last 50 years, covering the last 50 years. We noticed half the time the women were called Mrs. somebody, Miss or Mrs. somebody with no first name. So they, didn't get weren't treated much more than appendages to the men, it seemed. We do have a lot of records though, so we can't name that as an excuse for not knowing something. I'd like to raise a question now, and that is, what would it take? What are some good ideas for helping churches get their archives into shape. I mean, money, can we write a grant proposal? There's somebody.
Yeah, I'm Donna Simonton. I could make some comments on that. One of the things that I did during COVID, I'm a member at Universalist National Memorial down the street from All Souls. And the COVID time ended up being ideal for working on the archives. I was typically the only person there, but it really gave me a chance to do a lot of things. But what I did that was most useful was, because it's a small congregation, I reached out to any church that had Universalist in their name in the country. And lo and behold, 15 people responded. And so we have created a Universalist Heritage Network. And there were 2 professional archivists, one from the Santa Paula Church in California and one from Georgia. And they, were more than happy to share best practices for archiving. When I see the boxes, and that's certainly what we had to start out with and still have, but when you see All Souls versus what Universalist National Memorial has done, we have a long way to go. But because we worked with professional archivists and shared information and had meetings specifically about archiving techniques, that was a real big start. What format to use, what kind of paper to use for things. Are you going to record? What are you going to do with all those recordings? Are you going to digitize them, or are you going to put them onto paper? Just making decisions on how to do it and the space, but starting with archival information. And I will say that in terms of, there are lots of free resources available for that kind of information. And the DC History Center was integral for some of the searches that I wanted to do. We got a question about our stained glass windows. And when I contacted the center, I went in and they were able, this was pre-COVID, they were able to give me newspaper articles that compared the church at different times to see whether those windows were really Tiffany's. So contacting the DC History Center is a good thing to do as well. So I think I'll stop there.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Cheryl Rucker from Salem Baptist Church, and I've listened to this with a lot of interest. We've been working on our archives probably for two or three decades, and I grew out of the church library. And one of the things that I remember from attending a national conference of the Church and Synagogue Library Association. This one was in York, Pennsylvania, which was pretty close to the headquarters for the American Baptists. And during that meeting, the American Baptist Association offered to store church archives. We didn't take them up on their offer, but it sort of made me wonder, what kind of space would you have to just tell other churches, we can handle your archives? In the meantime, I have started trying to figure out the answer to the question about digitizing, because we are going to run out of space. If we keep holding on to all the church documents and artifacts and everything, I don't care how big our space is, we will eventually run out of space. But we also need to know about the quantity of cloud storage, the charges for cloud storage, making accessible to church members. It just generates a whole lot of other questions. And I'm wondering if anyone has tried doing that digitizing and how you did it, with what kind of equipment. I've asked for a scanner to start with, but I haven't gotten it yet. That would be my next experiment. So anyone out there been successful with their digitizing?
Well, I wouldn't say we're success. I mean, we have digitized a lot of stuff, but then what do you do with it? It is now in my personal Dropbox because the executive director of the church at the time didn't want to pay for Dropbox or whatever. So I'm glad and I guess I have unlimited space in that Dropbox because, and it, you know, it turned out convenient for during the shutdown because I could get, when people asked me for stuff, I could get it. But there's no way for anyone else to really look at it. I don't want to just, I'm not going to just share the Dropbox with everyone. So if someone asks for photos, I'll look through them, what I have, and put them in another Dropbox or download them and send them. So that's not a really good sustainable system. And I don't know what to do with these huge audio files when we've digitized cassettes, but I don't know what to do with that stuff. And I dread, you know, losing it because it's time consuming to digitize or, you know, pay to have digitized. We also have some footage that we've digitized, you know, some, there was a video of Reverend Eaton. Well, that's on YouTube. So that's one place to put footage. But anyway, and then, you know, you have to deal with, once you digitize stuff, the technology changes and, you know, the National Archives and the Library of Congress and libraries have to deal with this changing, I don't know, cloud storage or whatever. I hate to even think about it. But I think that's a big, really big issue to deal with. And then, of course, nowadays they may not hand out board minutes. They're all PDFs, but, you know, so then we have to store all those PDFs someplace and just losing, it seems easier to lose stuff when it's digital like that. We have the advantage of having an archivist from the Supreme Court as a member at All Souls. So he advised us on what scanner to buy, and Sarah talked about that rolled up panoramic photo that they're afraid to unroll. That the one I showed that's of the construction site, that was rolled up tightly too. It could not be unrolled without breaking, but he devised actually a plastic box from the Container Store with a refrigerator rack or something in the bottom and some water, you know, so it unrolled itself. It's 4 feet long and it's now framed. Actually, a scan of it is framed and in the library. It's stored flat. But anyway, so we do have some advantage and that scanner. But I'd be happy for advice from Derek or Anne, what we should do with that stuff.
So Derek, do you want to go to there? We have a couple hands up.
Yeah, let me go to Linda White.
Hi, Derek. Thank you very much. And first, I want to say hello to everybody and make note that there are a lot of AUGS members in this event tonight, the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society. So I want to first mention, and actually, Cheryl Rucker just mentioned something about church libraries. There is an organization of church libraries. And I realize that archives are not the same as church libraries, but some of those meetings have focused on archives. The other thing is, I'm kind of a member, I am a member of Mount Carmel Baptist Church. I was raised at Mount Carmel Baptist Church downtown at 3rd and I Streets. And I know that they hired an archivist a few years ago, Ida Jones, who many of you know. And I'm still not sure what Ida did with all of the archives at the church. I do know a lot of stuff was thrown away, and I'm not saying that's a good thing, of course, but what she did do was write a book about the minister. And I have to ask Ida if she first learned about Reverend Jernigan. By the way, the book is William Henry Jernigan, in Washington, D.C., an absolutely fascinating man. And I was like 8 years old when Reverend Jernigan died. So I didn't know him well, but I heard of him all my life. But once we start to really dig into these archives, we see that there's so many notable but relatively unknown people in these archives. So if somebody could maybe focus on one or two people, that's one thing. And then somebody else asked about digitization. We need a center somewhere where there's a book scanner. I know that there are different kinds of, I forgot what it's called, Derek, you know, where people can go to DC Public Library and scan materials, but I don't think there's an overhead scanner. And I know those are more expensive. They are at some libraries for sure. They have them at Library of Congress. There's one or two of them at American University, but they're so much easier to use and they don't damage the materials. But probably no one church can afford a book scanner. But the other thing is some of this will cost money in terms of paying somebody to digitize. But if we have our own central, how do you call it? A place where we can go, we don't have to pay the rates of the professional digitizers if we could get a young person to do that. And there are people who, you know, college students who are willing to do that. So the other thing is, and I've mentioned this to some of you, we need to have some kind of citywide event where we talk about the value of papers. There are still people who don't know about the value of both personal papers and institutional papers. So with that, I'll stop.
Who had their hand up? Anne?
I just wanted to bring up, there may actually be folks on this panel who participated in this, but back in the early 90s, the DC History Center, which was then called the Historical Society of Washington, DC, ran a program called Hidden Histories. And the concept behind this was to train the trainers, to train the volunteer or professional staff at churches to maintain and preserve and provide access to their own records. It was, I believe, it might have been through the NEH, but it was a pretty widespread program that, to my mind, hearing everybody talk today, I would love to figure out a way to bring a program like that back, where it's open to volunteers and staff of DC churches, where we have discussion like this with training, and then with training not only on, you know, archival procedures, but on which grants are available to apply for to get the equipment, either for your own institution or, as Linda was saying, to have a place where that infrastructure can be shared. I think that there's really there's a need for it. It's something that you know, at the DC History Center, I think I mentioned we have the records of a few churches, but there's no way for a collecting repository, as much as we would like to be the place to take in records of all churches. That is not appropriate. The records, I think, in most cases, should stay with the churches themselves. And our job is to make sure the public knows that they are actually available and accessible for researchers, whether or not you're a member of the church. And so our job is in sort of education and the outreach side of things. But if I could have a show of hands, like who would want to participate in a grant-funded, citywide, collaborative archival training that is focused specifically on the needs of churches? Yeah? Okay. All right. I mean, that's okay. I don't know where we go from here, but I do know that this is very much on our radar and something that I would love to pursue in the coming months.
I just want to pitch DC Public Library, People's Archive, just a minute. And just to echo what Anne said, we are interested in collecting church records. We do have some. We recently acquired the Turner Memorial AME Church archives. They're now located in Hyattsville, Maryland, but we're rooted in DC. The Mount Calvary Baptist Church archive, and of course, been working with Jean on the Lincoln Temple. So I also just want to mention the importance of volunteers. My advice is just, and I know a lot of you have been doing this already, but continue to reach out to volunteers in terms of getting things in order and doing some of those other things that appear small but are very important to your collection. So I just want to mention that.
I just wanted to say, this is Eloise White from 19th Street Baptist Church. And I just wanted to say that online tonight, we have 3 churches which have a connection that have begun to do some church archiving work. I want to give a shout out to Blanche for Vermont Avenue, because she reached out to me because Vermont Avenue is an offshoot of 19th Street. At the same time, I reached out for tonight's broadcast to Janice Osborne, who is the archivist at First Baptist Church of Washington, D.C., of which 19th Street is an offshoot. And so there are so many churches that have this kind of connection that if we could in some small way begin to collect our archives together. Over the last 2 years, Janice and I have been working on a collaborative church history group between our 2 churches. And my, I learned so much that we did not know what happened between 1802 and 1839 when we started. So there's so many unknown pieces that members of churches need to know. And maybe this group is a way to begin that kind of conversation.
Thank you, Ms. White. Yes, that's what I was talking about earlier about the cohort group. So what Vermont Avenue did was based on what I could identify from the records that I have, I set up like a family tree and asked for individuals from each church that was willing to start sharing ideas and helping to gather information and the whole 9 yards. So, and we're hoping to grow that experience, and we're going to get more into it as the year goes on.
Ambassador Maddie, you had your hand up. I just want to give you an opportunity to speak. No.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very, very pleased that I decided to listen to this session this evening. And I'm with Sarah Fairbrother over at Riverside Baptist Church, and I've been going there now for like 40 some odd years, going and coming from Washington, D.C. But my question is sort of two-pronged. It's very interesting to listen to the various churches, the history of the churches, and the issues of trying to archive the churches, but I'm directing my question to Derek. It seems in recent years that more and more people have stopped going to church. I spent a lot of time in Europe, and so many people stopped over there. They turned the churches into other edifices. And the situation is happening here with the younger people. And in recent years, I've noticed here in Washington, and I don't know if it's across the country, maybe you can answer that churches per se are not being constructed as churches, but they are being constructed as churches within buildings. And sometimes they are retail buildings, sometimes they are city buildings. And does this mean that church, in the sense of church being a history, archival, or whatever, is going into another era of existence? And if so, we really need to get some archiving going, and what can we do to put them into the track of being churches again? This is my personal assessment that I'm just asking. Thank you. Mr. Derek.
That's a tough one. I can't, I don't have an answer for that one.
Derek, this is Jean, if I may make an attempt. Ambassador Maddie, I think that, as I mentioned earlier with Lincoln Temple, when societies make changes, young people are seeking less restrictive or more creative ways to express, whether it's their religious beliefs or ideas in general. Sometimes the environment needs to reflect those desires. And one of the things we recognize at Lincoln Temple is that, the pipe organ is beautiful. I love it. I always have. But that may not be the instrument that really appeals to someone else. So there's, I think, an overall attempt to appeal to what people are going through secularly, so that the religious part of where they are, kind of reflects that too. It's familiar or comfortable. And you're right, a lot of churches are using industrial parks to have their buildings in. Others are, being a part of a downtown landscape. So it is a challenge, and I don't think there's any one answer, but I do sense that some of that is a reflection of where people are in their secular lives and wanting to have some familiarity of the secular with the religious. Just a stab at the idea.
Hayden, you had your hand up for a while. You want to go ahead, please?
I thought I would give you a brief idea of what the Washington Quaker meeting does with its historical records. I've been the historian at the meeting now for 15 or more years. For quite a while, our congregation has sent its historical records up to a Quaker University library in Pennsylvania, Swarthmore University, called the Friends Historical Library. And up there, it is very well kept, very well organized. We send the papers up, organized, and very accessible, either at the library itself or long distance. The staff is very happy to send copies of material to anyone that requests it. This means that we don't have, if we kept all of our stuff, Quaker meetings are traditionally very well documented. It's just a historical thing. But it means that we do not have a big storage problem. And the material from our meeting is up there with lots of other Quaker meetings. Most of the Washington meetings do the same thing, by the way. They send their papers up there. So if someone calls us and asks for something from an earlier period, I can refer them up to Swarthmore with complete confidence. We send them up in batches. I was not involved in the first big shipment, but I did the second shipment in, about 15 years ago, actually. Probably sent 17 or 18 boxes up there. However, we needed to keep some of the more recent records for our own purposes. I sent everything before 1990 and kept everything after that, and also went to all the various committees in the meeting to say, if you want older material kept here, let me know, and we keep it here, which we did. I just sent about 8 more boxes early this year and have 1 or 2 ancillary boxes that I'm getting ready to send also. What we've sent up has been paper because that's what we had, but the library has a full-time electronic, electronic archivist, someone who specifically deals with keeping things in the cloud or whatever. I don't know what she does, but that's what she does. I forwarded some electronic material today to say, please connect this material to blah, 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 full files, which you already have, and they do that. We now send many of our newer material, since everything is electronic these days, we just forward it up there. And they handle the organization, they handle the keeping of it and whatever. No muss, no fuss for us. I would say also in terms of But by the way, we keep a duplicate copy of our most vital records. Business meeting minutes, membership records, some financial stuff that still has legal implications. That kind of stuff we send there, but we also keep it. And it's, I've got to look for another room for it. I was talking with the building manager today. In terms of making your history available, our meeting was only established in 1930. We inherited the line from two other local meetings. Their papers, by the way, are up at Swarthmore. So our records only go back to 1990 and some discussion before that. But we've had a tradition of writing our history every 20 years. So there's a 1930 to 1953 volume, 53 to 73 was the second installment, 73 to 93, and I've just finished drafting 93 to 13. In the first three volumes, when those were published, the text was sent to a printer. He printed up some number of boxes of them. They were delivered to the office. And if you wanted one, you came to the office and you dropped a few bucks and you got one. We still have extra copies of those if anyone wants them. But this time around, we're going to do it differently. We're going to publish over Amazon self-publishing. And I really look into this. I've published some of my own historical studies over it. It's very, very easy to use. You don't pay a penny to publish, no matter how long it is. There's a 25-page minimum. It's easy to upload. If you find something wrong, you can take down the old manuscript and put up a new manuscript. As you set the price, if people actually buy your history, hey, you actually get a little, you get a little money back. I've gone to Starbucks a few times on my things. The real advantage is you can publish an electronic version and a print version, and the distribution is international. You don't have to come to the office of the Quaker meeting and ask for a copy, and our administrative secretary doesn't know where they are anyway, okay? You can go online anywhere in Alaska, Mongolia, South Africa, and you can get a copy.
Okay, all right, thanks, Hayden. We're getting close to wrapping up. We have about 5 minutes or so. I wanna get in another question or comment. Susan Stone-Cipher, you had your hand raised. Please go ahead.
Yes, A for the day for saying it correctly. Thank you so much. My name is Susan Stone-Cipher, and for the past 16 years, I have been the historiographer of the Episcopal Diocese of Washington. I would have to get money from Hayden to go to Starbucks for that title, because it really means that I'm trying to manage the archives for the Episcopal churches in DC, Montgomery, Prince George's, Charles, and St. Mary's County. So I just had a couple comments about other issues people brought up. I'm a volunteer. I have been a volunteer. I retired 6 months before COVID, and only on March 15th am I going to be able to get back to the archives, because they're stored on the 4th floor of the administrative building of the Washington National Cathedral, which has been closed. So, oh my gosh, I was already behind. I can't imagine what it's going to be like now. So in the Episcopal Church, as a liturgical church, we have a larger body, the National Episcopal Church, that gives us guidelines. How long? I wish I was related to Patty Stone-Cipher. I'm pretty sure she's related to my husband. She's divorced from her Stone-Cipher. I've been married to mine for 38 years. So the good news is these national guidelines say, don't keep the little envelopes that everybody put their collection in. You can toss those. You do need to keep the minutes of your board, whatever that is. And I encourage people to print them out. Otherwise, we can start showing floppy disks, CDs, thumb drives, all those very unstable things. And the other thing that I really encourage people to do is to step back and say, what is your priority? If you have the means to keep all of those other things from that women's circle. My grandmother was a very strong member of Foundry Methodist Church, and my grandfather at one point was the treasurer. If you can keep that ladies' circle minutes and you have room for it and space for it, that's wonderful. Otherwise, I don't know if we turn to Derek, what we would do with that material, because it is valuable material when you go through and see what is in there. The history of women who, let's face it, really ran the church, but in the Episcopal Church couldn't become ministers until the late 70s. And then the transition that is made for almost all of our churches as women have been going to work, are not there to feed people during the day for the ladies' luncheons, et cetera. But in any case, I just wanted to say, if you're part of a larger organization, you could turn to them for ideas for what to keep and what not to keep. I'm happy to reach out to Derek or Ann to share what the National Episcopal Church shares in case that's might be of some kind of assistance. And my colleague also suggested the National Episcopal Historians and Archivists have a publication about how to manage parish archives. Thank you so much for this. And please keep the faith, everybody, as you look at the boxes of stuff.
Thank you. We're gonna have to leave it there. I just want to thank everybody for attending. This was a wonderful, wonderful discussion. Thank you so much to All Souls for hosting this. Thank you to Vanette, Jean, Sarah, and Mara, and Anne. Everybody was wonderful. I want to make a pitch to please register for the DC History Conference, which will take place March 31st through April 2nd. Friday and Saturday sessions will be held here at the library, and the Letitia Brown lecture will be held at the Charles Sumner School Museum and Archives. I hope to see you all. And again, thank you and have a wonderful evening.